At 7:12 in the morning, a 90-ton Caterpillar 390F went silent in the middle of the Maryville overpass site, and 34 men stopped moving with it. The crane operator cut his engine. The concrete crew stepped back. Nobody spoke. Reagan Voss stood at the edge of the equipment yard, the state deadline running through her head like a number she couldn't stop. Then the gate opened. A man in a faded flannel shirt walked in carrying a toolbox that had seen better decades. No badge, no hard hat. Reagan looked at him and said in front of everyone, "Who called him in here?" The question stayed in the air. Colt Brennan didn't answer. He was already looking at the machine. Patty Oakes appeared at Reagan's elbow before the silence could fully settle. She was the site equipment coordinator, had been with Voss Infrastructure since before Reagan took the company over from her father, and she had the look of someone who had prepared for this exact conversation. "I called him," Patty said. "Marcus and Tyler have been on that machine for 90 minutes and it hasn't moved." Reagan's eyes stayed on Colt. "Who is he?" "He's good," Patty said, which wasn't an answer. Reagan set her coffee on top of a surveying stake. "Give him 10 minutes. It wasn't an endorsement." Her voice made that clear. Colt didn't ask for permission or tools or background. He set his box down in the dirt and walked a slow circle around the 390F, the way someone might walk around a car. They were considering buying hands at his sides, eyes moving from the undercarriage to the boom arm to the hydraulic lines running up the left flank of the machine. He wasn't looking for the obvious. That much was plain from how he moved. He was looking for something specific, and he already had a theory about where it was. Marcus Webb and Tyler Holt stood near the cab with their arms crossed. They were the two engineers who had spent the past hour and a half failing to find the problem, and their discomfort at being watched by a man in a flannel shirt was not well hidden. Marcus had his tablet out. Tyler had his hands in his pockets and his jaw set in the way people set their jaws when they don't want their faces to be read. Derek Shaw materialized beside Reagan with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent decades positioning himself next to decision-makers at the right moment. He was 48, operations director, had been her father's man before he became hers, and he spoke in a low voice, calibrated to sound like reason. "He doesn't have a Caterpillar 390 operating certificate," Derek said. "If he causes additional damage, we have no insurance coverage." "He's not operating it," Reagan said. "He's looking at it, same liability exposure. I'd recommend we get the regional rep on the phone from Knoxville before we allow anyone else to—" "Derek." She said his name like a period at the end of a sentence. He stopped. The site around them had resumed a tentative kind of activity, workers drifting back toward their stations, doing small things, keeping busy without committing to anything. The crane operator had his door open and his arm resting on it. Everyone was watching Colt without appearing to watch Colt. Colt crouched beside the auxiliary hydraulic manifold on the left rear of the machine. He had a small flashlight, the kind that fit in a shirt pocket, and he was angling it into a gap between two housings that sat flush against the chassis wall. The angle was wrong for anyone standing upright to see into. He stayed in that position for a long moment, not shifting, not adjusting, a man reading something that required his full attention. Then he stood, wiped his hands on the rag folded over his belt, turned toward Patty without turning toward Reagan, which was a choice, even if he hadn't made it consciously. "When did this machine last have its hydraulic fluid changed?" Patty had already pulled the maintenance binder from under her arm. She had grabbed it without being asked. Reagan took a half step forward. She did not notice herself doing it. Patty ran her finger down the service log. 14 months ago, she said. Colt nodded once, the nod of someone confirming what they already knew. Caterpillar's specification for this model in high humidity operating conditions is every 6 months. Tennessee in summer qualifies. He was already opening the secondary service panel on the left flank of the machine, not the primary access point that most technicians went to first, but a supplementary panel set into the chassis at knee height, flush enough that it was easy to overlook. He opened it without consulting a manual. "Here," he said, and indicated 2 points with 2 fingers, not summoning anyone, just marking the location. Marcus Webb stepped closer despite himself. He looked where Colt was pointing. The hydraulic filter was packed solid, not partially restricted, not showing early-stage blockage, but genuinely sealed, the kind of accumulation that builds across missed intervals. Beside it, the pressure relief valve sat at a deflection that was nearly imperceptible from a standing position, perhaps 3 degrees off its rated seat, the kind of drift that accrued over load cycles and heat and was almost never identified unless someone was specifically looking for it. Filter blockage combined with pressure relief valve drift, Colt said. He wasn't explaining it to the room. He was narrating it to himself, the way someone reads a text aloud to confirm they understood it. When the relief valve is off spec and the filter is blocked, the system reads acceptable pressure at the gauge, but can't move fluid through the circuit under actual load. The machine runs its diagnostic, sees numbers that look right, and shuts down anyway, because the measured flow rate doesn't match the expected value. Marcus stared at the valve for 3 seconds. Then he pulled out his phone. He searched quietly Bechtel's technical publications archive, which he still had access to from a previous contract job. He typed in the name he had just processed. The result came back in 4 seconds. He read it. His face changed. Tyler leaned over his shoulder and read it too. Colton Brennan, Chief Equipment Engineer, Bechtel Corporation, MENA Division, 2009 through 2020, principal author of the Zero Downtime Maintenance Protocol for the Doha Metro Infrastructure Package, Phases 1 through 3, operational savings attributed to the protocol, $47 million over the contract term. Marcus looked up from his phone, looked at the man in the flannel shirt who was now replacing the hydraulic filter with a component from his own toolbox. Neither Marcus nor Tyler said anything. Not to Reagan, not to Derek, not to each other. 23 minutes after Colt had crouched beside that manifold, the Caterpillar 390F's engine turned over. 90 tons of machine vibrated back into motion, and the sound of it moved through the ground beneath everyone's feet. Several of the 34 workers started clapping without planning to. Reagan stood at the edge of the equipment yard and did not move. She had run construction sites for 11 years, had handled labor disputes and material failures and a lawsuit that had nearly taken the company down. She could not remember the last time she had stood in front of a situation with nothing useful to say. Colt closed his toolbox, walked to Patty and handed her the invoice, single page, handwritten, itemized. He picked up the toolbox, turned for the gate. "Hey," he stopped. "Can you stay until end of day?" she said. He didn't turn around immediately. A pause, not hesitation, exactly, but the pause of someone running a calculation with more than one variable. "My hourly rate isn't cheap," he said. "I know," Reagan said. He stood there another moment. Then he set the toolbox down. He spent the afternoon in the far corner of the equipment yard, working through the secondary fleet, the 2 skid steers and the articulated dump truck that were due for their own inspections at month's end. Patty had given him the maintenance binders without being asked. Reagan watched from the window of the site office, a converted shipping container with a whiteboard on one wall and a folding table that served as a desk. She watched for perhaps 3 minutes total. She was not the kind of person who watched things. Derek Shaw was the kind of person who gathered information quietly and spent it at the right moment. By 1 in the afternoon, he had run Colt's name through 2 contractor databases and the Tennessee Secretary of State's business registry. He found nothing extraordinary, a sole proprietor equipment service operation out of Maryville. No employees, no liability claims, no disciplinary actions, no red flags, no exceptional credentials. He filed this into the category of lucky amateurs and moved to the more productive problem of removing Colt Brennan from the site before he became a fixture. The mechanism Derek chose was technically correct. Site access badges under Voss Infrastructure's standard operating procedure were issued through his office, required a completed contractor intake packet, a background authorization form, and proof of current liability insurance naming Voss as an additional insured. Colt had none of these on file because Patty had called him the way you call someone you trust informally, at 6:40 in the morning, when a machine that was supposed to be running wasn't. Derek put the memo on Reagan's desk at 2:15. She read it, set it down, looked out the window. Colt was seated on an overturned milk crate beside the articulated dump truck, his flashlight in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. He wrote in the economical way of someone accustomed to capturing information quickly, short lines. No flourishes. Reagan picked up the memo again, put it back down unsigned. Derek's memo was not wrong. The requirement existed for real reasons. Contractors without proper documentation were a liability problem, and Reagan had spent enough years running projects to know that liability problems didn't resolve themselves. She had also spent enough years running projects to know when a rule was being used for its intended purpose and when it was being used for something else. She sat at the desk for 11 minutes. The whiteboard on the wall had the project schedule written out in 3 colors of marker, and she had looked at it so many times that she had stopped seeing it. She looked at it now, The pour date was circled in red. At 3, Patty brought 2 cups of coffee out to the yard. She handed one to Colt and kept one herself. They stood beside the dump truck, and she told him the project timeline, the state milestone dates, the concrete pour sequence, the subcontractor schedule for the steel reinforcement work due to start in 11 days. Colt listened, asked 2 questions. The questions were the kind that revealed, without announcing themselves, that the person asking them understood not just the mechanical situation but the scheduling logic behind it. How a delayed pour would cascade into a delayed inspection, which would cascade into a penalty trigger in the state contract. Patty looked at him over her coffee cup with an expression she did not explain. At 4:30, Reagan walked the perimeter of the site as she did each day. She passed the gate. Outside the fence, an old F-250 was parked on the gravel shoulder, and in the passenger seat, visible through the window, was a girl of about 9 with a hardcover book open on her knees. The girl had her father's quality of stillness, the quality of someone who did not require distraction from her surroundings. She looked up when Reagan passed, did not smile, nodded once, in the manner of someone acknowledging a stranger without needing to assign a verdict to them. Reagan nodded back, walked on. The vibratory compactor showed its first symptoms at 6:50 the following morning, a rhythmic shudder on startup that went away after 40 seconds, then returned at irregular intervals during operation. It was the kind of thing an experienced operator noticed, and a newer one might attribute to the grade of the ground. The operator noticed. By 7:15, Derek had already drafted the recommendation: contact the manufacturer's regional service representative in Knoxville, schedule a diagnostic inspection, expect a 3 to 4 day turnaround before a technician could be on site. Reagan read the recommendation at 7:20. "We don't have 3 days," she said. "The machine might hold it reduced. If the compactor goes down during sub-base prep, we lose the pour window." She closed the folder. "Call Brennan." Derek's face shifted by approximately 2 degrees, which was, for Derek, expressive. "I'd like to go on record that—" "You're on record," Reagan said. "Call him." Colt arrived at 8. He had the toolbox and he had June, who went back to the truck with her book while he walked to the compactor and started his examination. This time, Marcus positioned himself beside the machine from the beginning, not across the yard, not at a professional distance, but beside it, watching. Colt didn't acknowledge the company. He crouched, stood, moved, crouched again. He asked Marcus for the hour meter reading. Marcus gave it without needing to be asked twice. "Eccentric bearing," Colt said, after 7 minutes. "Starting to wear. You probably have 3 weeks before failure, but the vibration frequency is going to drift out of spec within the next few days, and your compaction numbers won't hold." He looked at Marcus. "Replacement bearing on site?" Marcus checked the parts inventory. "No, I do," Colt said. He went to the truck. Reagan was standing near the compactor when he came back. It was the first time they had been within 10 feet of each other without Derek or Patty, or the site crew in the immediate vicinity. "Where'd you work before this?" she asked. "Different places." "What kind of different places?" He considered the question with more deliberation than it seemed to require. "The kind with bigger machines," he said. It was not a satisfying answer. Reagan had received unsatisfying answers from people who were hiding embarrassment, from people hiding incompetence, and from people hiding something else. This felt like the third kind, but she couldn't name the thing. The bearing replacement took 40 minutes. The compactor ran clean at 8:57, well ahead of the morning break. 2 workers called out "good work," Colt using his first name, without having been introduced. He acknowledged this by picking up his wrench. Marcus Webb made a note on his tablet. He had been making notes throughout, not in the way of someone documenting a process, but in the way of someone revising an earlier conclusion. He didn't say anything to Reagan. He didn't have to. Reagan had been watching his face, and his face had said enough. The rest of the day moved at its proper pace. Derek stayed in the site office. Reagan spent the afternoon in the field, which was not unusual, and stopped twice near the quadrant where Colt was working, which was. At 5:40, Colt loaded his toolbox into the truck bed. June was in the passenger seat, asleep against the window, a book open face down on her lap. He stood by the driver's door for a moment before getting in, looking at her the way fathers look at children who have managed to sleep through noise with a specific kind of relief. Reagan switched off the light in the site office and stood in the doorway. She watched the truck idle at the gate. Then she went back inside. Derek placed the memo on Reagan's desk the next morning, with a second page, attached a paragraph from the Voss Infrastructure Standard Contractor Policy on liability exposure for unregistered site personnel. If an individual on a Voss worksite without a current contractor agreement sustained an injury, the company's umbrella insurance would not apply. Voss would carry the exposure directly. This was correct. It was also the most precisely useful true thing Derek had found in his search for leverage. Reagan read both pages, picked up a pen, held it. Outside, Colt was in the equipment yard with a differential housing open in front of him, recording serial numbers in his notebook. His movements were unhurried. He had no self-consciousness about being watched and no interest in performing for anyone who might be watching. She set the pen down. "I'll need 48 hours, she told Derek. "I'll get the contractor paperwork processed. He can return with a formal agreement." "The liability exposure exists today," Derek said. "I understand that," she said. 48 hours. She went to find Colt herself. Not through Patty. She crossed the yard and stopped 3 feet from where he was working, and he looked up. "I need 48 hours to get the paperwork in order," she said. "After that, you can come back on a formal contract." He studied her for a moment. "Or I don't come back." She hadn't expected that. Not the words, and not the flatness with which they were delivered, no anger in it, no negotiating posture, just the other option stated plainly. She didn't answer right away. Patty, for her part, had been watching. She waited until Reagan was back in the site office, then went to Derek's door and knocked. When he looked up, she said, "That man fixed 2 machines in 2 days that your engineers couldn't touch. You know that." Derek said something about protocols and organizational structure. He said it in the measured way he said most things, carefully, without apparent emotion, in a register designed to sound like institutional wisdom rather than personal interest. Patty had worked in construction long enough to recognize the difference between those two things, and she had worked under Derek long enough to know the precise weight of the fact that he controlled her contract renewal. She looked at him for a long moment after he finished. Then she went back to her desk and began pulling up files she hadn't opened in years. At 4, Colt packed his toolbox. June was in the truck, awake, watching him through the windshield. "We're not going back?" she said. "Don't know yet," he said. He pulled out of the gravel lot and turned onto the county road. Reagan stood at the window of the site office and watched the truck go. She opened her laptop, typed his full name into the search bar for the first time. The results loaded in 3 seconds. She read for 4 minutes without moving. Then she took her hands off the keyboard and placed them flat on the table. The site was dark outside the window. She had sent away the person who had kept everything moving, and she had understood why, and she had done it anyway, and now she understood what she had actually done. There was a difference between those two things, understanding a reason and understanding a consequence, and Reagan Voss was not someone who had often confused them. She sat in the quiet office with the screen dimming in front of her and thought about a man she had dismissed in 10 words on a Tuesday morning, and the machines that had run because of him, and the ones that still needed to. Patty Oakes was not, by nature, an archivist. She kept organized records because disorganized records cost money, and she had seen what that looked like on a job site. But she was not someone who read old files for pleasure, and she had not opened the 2019 proposal archive in at least 3 years. She found it on the second day of Colt's absence, in a folder whose name had been changed at some point, not by her from the original file name to something generic. Equipment Maintenance Framework, internal reference. The document metadata still carried the original. She noticed this because she was looking, and the metadata was what she found. The proposal was 42 pages. The cover read, Colton Brennan, P.E., Chief Equipment Engineer, Bechtel Corporation, submitted to Voss Infrastructure Group, October 14, 2019. She read the executive summary, then 3 more sections. Then she walked to Reagan's office without knocking. Reagan was on a call. She looked up, saw Patty's face, and said into the phone, "I'll call you back." She set it down. Patty placed the document on the desk without a word. Reagan read the cover page. The name, the date. She turned to the technical framework section, the section that had formed the basis, she now understood, for the equipment maintenance interval policy that Voss Infrastructure had been operating under for 4 years. The policy that had been presented to her as an internal development, assembled by Derek's team from industry sources. She read slowly. Not because the language was difficult, but because she was not reading for information. She was reading for something else, the recognition of a mind behind the words. the same mind that had crouched beside a hydraulic manifold and told her, in plain language, exactly what was wrong with her machine and why. The prose in the document had the same quality, unadorned, precise, built to be useful rather than impressive. Her father had received this in 2019. Someone had read it, extracted what they needed, and renamed the file. She turned the pages without rushing. Derek was summoned. He came in, saw the document on the desk, and his posture made a small adjustment. This was submitted through standard channels, he said. Unsolicited proposals from external firms go to operations for review. The content was incorporated as part of a broader synthesis. He wrote our hydraulic service intervals, Reagan said. He wrote the eccentric bearing replacement schedule. The section on high humidity operating conditions in the southeast is his, word for word. She looked at Derek steadily. And when he walked onto this site, you told me he was a liability. Derek said other things. They were structurally sound. She stopped hearing them somewhere in the middle. She picked up her phone and dialed. 4 rings, voicemail. She set the phone down and looked at the document again, his name on the cover, the date, the Bechtel letterhead. She thought about the morning he'd walked through the gate, and she had made her assessment in the time it takes to form a sentence. She thought about the 23 minutes. She called again. He answered on the second ring. I need you to come back, she said. A pause long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then, why? I found the 2019 proposal, silence, on his end. Not the silence of someone surprised, the silence of someone processing something they had long stopped expecting to surface. I'll be there tomorrow morning, he said. Thank you, she said. 7, he said. The line went quiet. He arrived at 7:02. Patty handed him the formal contractor agreement without ceremony. He signed it, folded his copy, put it in his back pocket, and got to work. Reagan had asked him, before he returned, to conduct a full fleet assessment, every piece of heavy equipment on the Maryville site, documented and rated. He began with the machines he hadn't yet examined and worked outward, writing in his notebook in the morning and transferring to the assessment form in the afternoon. He worked without commentary, and the site moved around him the way it had been moving before the 390F stopped steadily, toward something. On the second morning of the assessment, Derek requested a meeting with the full technical team. Reagan was present. So was Colt, which Derek had not anticipated. Derek stood at the head of the folding table and said that, while he understood the value of supplementary expertise, introducing an outside contractor into core maintenance decision-making represented a structural risk, and that outside consultants should be advisory rather than operational, and that clear boundaries, he used the phrase twice, were necessary for internal cohesion. He spoke for 4 minutes. Colt listened to all of it without shifting in his chair or crossing his arms. When Derek finished, Colt reached into his notebook and placed a single sheet on the table, 47 items across 6 machines, numbered sequentially. Items 1 through 12. Maintenance flags, overdue service, components approaching the end of their rated intervals. Items 13 through 29. Watch items, conditions to monitor but not immediately actionable. Items 30 through 47. Red flag items, 6 of them marked with a double asterisk. Those 6, in his assessment, presented a risk of operational failure or personnel hazard within 2 to 3 weeks under normal site conditions. Marcus Webb reached across the table and picked up the sheet. He read it once, then again. Then he said, "These are all accurate." He said it to the room, which meant he said it to Derek and to Reagan in equal measure. Derek looked at the sheet, said nothing. That evening, Reagan brought 2 chairs out to the picnic table beside the site office. She sat down with Colt's supplementary notes while he worked through the last items in the assessment. The Tennessee evening came in slowly, temperature dropping, light going long and gold across the gravel, the highway a quarter-mile away sounding farther than it was. She was reading the section on the crane's slewing mechanism when she asked, "How long were you married?" He didn't break stride with his pen. 8 years. She waited. There was no more. She didn't ask again. She went back to the notes. The slewing ring section was thorough, detailed, careful, the same quality of attention that characterized everything he put on paper. She read it more slowly than she needed to. The light was good, and the evening was quiet, and there was no particular reason to be done with it. June came around the corner of the site office carrying 2 water bottles. She set one in front of Reagan and one in front of her father. Then she looked at Reagan, that level, unhurried look before turning and walking back toward the truck. Reagan watched her go, Colt looked up from his notes. He looked at June's shape in the distance, then looked at Reagan, and something passed between them that carried no words, not sentiment, not announcement, just two people registering the same thing from different sides of it. Reagan turned back to the slewing section. Read it from the beginning. Derek made his final move on a Wednesday morning, a phone call to Gerald Pruitt, the state project liaison based out of Nashville, who held contractual oversight authority over all public infrastructure projects above $25 million. Derek told Pruitt that Voss Infrastructure was utilizing an outside contractor who may not hold certifications required under the state's Public Works Compliance Framework, and that this potentially constituted a breach of the project agreement. Pruitt requested a compliance review meeting. Reagan received the notification at 9:14. She drove to the state field office in Knoxville at 2 in the afternoon. She sat across from Gerald Pruitt and a compliance specialist named Donna Marsh. She answered their questions with what she had, which was not quite enough. Reagan knew the sequence of Derek's move as she sat in that room. She had been in contract negotiations long enough to recognize a procedural ambush, the kind that used true statements, the way a lockpicker used tension. Not to open anything, but to create pressure while the real work happened elsewhere. Derek had built his case from a gap he believed existed. He had not verified that the gap was real. At 2:31, her phone lit up on the table. An email from Patty, a document attached. She opened it without excusing herself. Tennessee Board of Mechanical Engineering Contractor Certification. Colton Brennan. License number. Certification category. Heavy Equipment Mechanical Contracting. Issuance date. Renewal date. 8 months prior, November. Current, and in full compliance with all state requirements for public works contracting. Derek had run 3 databases. None of them was the Tennessee Board of Mechanical Engineering Active Contractor Registry, which was maintained on a separate state system and updated on an independent schedule. He had looked in the wrong places and found nothing, and concluded there was nothing to find. Reagan turned her phone screen toward Gerald Pruitt. His certification is current, she said. Renewed last November. She gave Donna Marsh the license number. Donna typed it in. The system returned the record in 11 seconds. Everything appears to be in order, Donna said. The meeting ended at 2:43. Reagan walked to the parking lot, called Derek from the sidewalk. Be in my office at 4 o'clock, she said. She did not explain. She drove back to the Maryville site and found Colt at the base of the crane, completing the final item in the assessment. She stood beside him and told him what had happened: Derek's call to the liaison, the meeting, Patty's email, and the 12-minute resolution, in the same tone she would use to relay a revised schedule. Colt looked at her when she finished. You handled it yourself. That's my job, she said. He nodded. It was not the nod he'd been giving her over the past week, not agreement, not acknowledgement of a technical fact. It was something closer to recognition, the kind you can't manufacture and can't ask for. She didn't comment on it. Neither did he. The crane stood above them in the early evening light, its boom arm extending out over the section of the overpass that would receive concrete in 48 hours. The site was quieting down around them, crew signing out, equipment going dark, the particular sound of a construction site at day's end, which was not silence but something close to rest. Colt turned back to the final notation in his assessment. Reagan stayed where she was. Neither of them had anywhere they needed to be for another few minutes, and neither of them moved to change that. Derek's title remained Operations Director. His responsibilities were redistributed. He moved into internal compliance documentation, a role that used his organizational precision, and removed him from field decision-making entirely. No announcement was made. None was needed. Colt submitted the final fleet assessment report on a Thursday. 61 pages, all items addressed, recommendations prioritized, replacement parts sourced and quoted. He gave it to Reagan directly, not to Patty, which was the first time he had handed anything to her without an intermediary. She accepted it without making anything of it. He collected his notebook and his flashlight and worked through the site's equipment return checklist. He was sitting on the step of the Caterpillar 390F when she found him, the same machine, the same left side panel, with the same morning angle of light across the equipment yard that had been there on the first day. He had his notebook open on his knee but wasn't writing. He was looking at the machine. Reagan stopped a few feet away. She had learned, over the past 2 weeks, that there was no useful purpose in filling the space around Colt Brennan with words. He would say something when there was something to say, and the things he said tended to weigh the same as silence, only more precise. Final report's thorough, she said. Should hold you through the end of the project, he said. You'll want someone to check the crane's slewing ring again in 6 weeks. I'll put it in the schedule. They stood there. Around them, the site was in motion, workers at their stations, equipment running, the overpass structure taking shape in the slow daily increments that construction moved in. The project that had stopped cold on a Tuesday morning was now 1 day ahead of the revised state schedule. Colt closed the notebook, settled the pen into the spiral, put the notebook in his bag without ceremony. Reagan watched his hand do it. What's next for you? She asked. June starts 4th grade in September, he said. Until then, whatever comes up. I might have more equipment that needs inspection, she said. Might, he said. He didn't stand up. She didn't turn to go. The machinery noise filled the space between them without filling it. It was the kind of quiet that didn't require anything from either of them. She had managed construction sites for over a decade. She had learned to move through work at the pace work required, without getting attached to outcomes she couldn't control. She did not often stand in one place without a reason. She was standing here without one she could name, and she was aware of that, and she stayed anyway. The overpass structure was visible above the equipment yard, the rebar and formwork of the main span, a shape that had not existed 8 weeks ago. It would be a bridge. Cars would cross it for decades, and no one in them would know about a Tuesday morning and a 90-ton machine in 23 minutes. June came around the back of the dump truck, self-contained as always, finished with whatever she had been doing, moving at her own pace. She walked to her father and stood beside him without announcement. She looked at Reagan, then at Colt, with the particular calm of a child who has learned to read situations without being told what they mean. She didn't say anything. She slid her hand into Colt's. Reagan looked at that, then at Colt's face, which had shifted by a degree that was not large but was unmistakable. Safe drive, Reagan said. Thanks for the work, Colt said. He got to his feet, June still holding his hand, and they walked toward the truck. 3 weeks after the Maryville site had gone still on a Tuesday morning and started again 23 minutes later, the first concrete pour for the overpass's main span took place on schedule. Reagan stood on the staging platform with the project manager and the state's field inspector, and watched 12 yards of concrete move through the boom pump and settle into the forms that 34 workers had spent 6 days preparing. The inspector signed the milestone documentation. Reagan signed below him. She drove back to Knoxville, sat at her desk, looked at the laptop screen for a moment without opening anything. Then she opened her email and typed a single line. The 390F is running clean. Thought you'd want to know. She sent it. Closed the laptop. At a kitchen table on Sycamore Lane in Maryville, Colt's phone lit up beside his coffee cup. He read the email. Set the phone face down on the table. June looked up from her homework. Who's that? Someone from the job, he said. The CEO one? He didn't answer. He picked the phone back up. He typed, good. Remember to change the hydraulic fluid on schedule. He sent it and put the phone in his pocket. Across town, Reagan read the reply in her office. She sat back in her chair and smiled, a small, private thing, 4 seconds long, gone before she pulled up the next item on her agenda. On Saturday, Patty ran into Colt at Hatcher's Hardware on Main Street. He was looking at drive sockets. She asked how he was. Fine, he said. She gave him the look she gave things she had formed opinions about. She asked about you, Patty said, just so you know. He turned a socket over in his hand. Okay, he said. He put it back on the rack. Then he picked up a full set of combination wrenches in a size range he already owned and placed them in his basket without apparent deliberation. Patty watched this. She said nothing. She went to find her caulk gun. He drove home. June had soccer practice on Saturdays, and he sat in the bleachers with the other parents he had exchanged approximately 400 words with over the past 2 years. He watched June move across the field in the particular way she moved, careful, deliberate, always knowing where the ball was going before it got there. He thought about a conversation he hadn't had and wondered what the opening of it would sound like if he were the one to start it. He didn't call, but he thought about it longer than he had the week before. On Sunday afternoon, the F-250 sat on the gravel turnout beside the access road to the Maryville overpass site. The gate was locked weekend. No crew. Equipment dark, but the structure was there against the sky. The concrete of the main span still curing. Colt sat in the driver's seat, engine off, window down. June sat beside him with a library book, legs crossed on the seat, fully absorbed. He was looking at the bridge. He thought about the 390F, the pressure relief valve. 14 months of deferred maintenance converging into one Tuesday morning when a 90-ton machine would not move. He thought about the 23 minutes. He thought about other things, which he did not sort into any order. His phone vibrated on the center console. He looked at the screen. Reagan Voss. He looked at it for one full second. June did not look up from her book. He picked up the phone. The excavator had been the first thing that stopped. It was not the last thing that started again.